Hello, everyone. Welcome to the National Ecosystem Services Partnership webinar. I'm Lydia Olander here at Duke University, and today we're having a talk on interpreting the IPBES report, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services report, presented by Stephen Polasky of the University of Minnesota and Alex Pfaff from Duke University. Once we get going, if you have comments or questions, your line will be muted, so please put those into the chat box. And if you want everyone to see them, put everyone. But if you want just the organizer to see this, Sarah Mason is controlling all of that, and you can send a note to her. We will read questions off at the end, off of the chat box. So please put your questions there. So just briefly, I'm going to give a little background on the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, and then we'll get into the presentation. So we think many of the people on the phone are new to NESP, and we just wanted to let people know what it is. This is an organization or partnership that includes both public and private individuals and organizations to enhance collaboration within the ecosystem services community and to strengthen coordination of policy, market implementation, and research at the national level. And this is really a United States-focused partnership. We have a community of practice where we send out emails. We have a quarterly newsletter. We offer these webinars. We also have a bunch of materials in a website, an online guidebook and other materials that are available on that website, and a number of experts that we've worked with and are happy to connect people to. The goals of this partnership are to create a national network for sharing ecosystem services information, establish pathways for implementation of ecosystem services concepts, integrate ecosystem services into decision-making, and create ecosystem services frameworks that are standardized, intuitive, and credible. So now, just a quick introduction of our presenters today. Stephen Polasky is a professor of ecological and environmental economics at the University of Minnesota. His research focus is on issues at the intersection of ecology and economics and includes the impacts of land use and land management on the provision and value of ecosystem services and natural capital. And Alex Pfaff is a professor of public policy, economics, and environment at Duke University, trained in economics. His focus is how economic development interacts with the environment and natural resources, and given that, how to improve policy impacts. And now I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. This is Stephen Polasky at the University of Minnesota. So as Lydia said, we're going to talk about the recently released IPBES Global Assessment. So if you go to the next slide. So IPBES, like IPCC, is a intergovernmental science policy program. This is several years worth of work. Actually, you see there in the lower left, 17 years worth if we total up all of the hours of all the people who worked on this. But it was, there are 3 co-chairs, and then there are a number of coordinating lead authors who are kind of to corral each of the major chunks of the report. Both Alex and I were among the 24 coordinating lead authors, a wider set of lead authors and contributing authors. So all in all, you can see this is a very large effort over several years, meant to be like the IPCC. What that does for climate change, this is meant to do for biodiversity and ecosystem services. Okay, next slide. So I briefly want to give you the kind of high-level messages from this, and then we'll kind of go through more systematically the review. But both Alex and I got used to talking to decision makers who sometimes have short attention spans, so put the messages that you really want them to learn up front, and that's what I'm doing here. So next slide. The first, I probably don't need to say this to people who are listening in, but the biosphere on which humanity depends is being altered to an unparalleled degree. Next slide. And in particular, that has consequences both for humans and for biodiversity. So the report shows the impacts on biodiversity, which is declining faster than at any time in human history. Next. It's not just other species, but nature provides vital contributions to our own well-being. Next. And while there's certainly more material goods being produced, of food, energy, and materials, this has increasingly come at the expense of nature's ability to provide other contributions. So everything from water quality regulation to sense of identity and place. Next. No, go back. There we go. The whole report basically was outlined into 6 chapters. The first chapter was kind of introductory. The second chapter is where a lot of the real meat of the report is. And in fact, there's sort of 3 separate parts to chapter 2. The status and trends in nature, the status and trends in nature's contributions to people, and then the drivers, what's causing the changes to nature and nature's contributions to people. So Alex was one of the coordinating lead author on the drivers section, and I was a coordinating lead author on nature's contributions to people. So this lays out kind of what are the status and trends, and then what are the impacts of this? So how well have we done, or how poorly have we done in achieving the biodiversity targets under the Aichi targets, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Climate Agreement. That's chapter 3. Chapter 4 and 5 are looking forward. So chapter 4 looks at plausible future scenarios and what happens under those plausible scenarios to both nature and people. Chapter 5 turns it around and asks, what would we need to do in order to have a sustainable future, one in which both nature and people thrive? And then finally, chapter 6 talks about the policy, so what are the policy windows or opportunities and challenges? So next slide. So I'm going to talk, kind of give you a very quick overview of the whole report. And then after that, both Alex and I will talk in more depth about the parts of the report that we're most knowledgeable on. So that material in chapter 2 on drivers and nature's contributions to people. And Alex will also talk about policy responses and what might be effective in thinking about these challenges and trying to change these trends. So starting off, one of the things the report did was pull together what was the impact on the biosphere, and pulling together kind of the globally, what do we know about this? And as you can see by the statistics here, we have fundamentally reconfigured the surface of the Earth. So 75% of land area is very significantly altered. Majority of the oceans are experiencing cumulative impacts. Particular ecosystems are even harder hit. So over 85% of wetland area has been lost since 1700. Next slide. So kind of at a very high level, one of the analogies that we talked about is that the fabric of life is deteriorating. There's unraveling of the fabric of life. It hasn't totally unraveled yet, but it's showing signs of stress. Next slide. One of the places you can see this most clearly is in the summary of evidence at a global level on what has happened to plants and animals. What do we know about both what has gone extinct in the wild, which is not that much, but what is threatened, either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And you can see here by taxonomic group what falls in the various categories. So there, for some, there are a large gray bar in the middle, which is we simply don't know. We don't have enough information. But clearly, there are quite a few groups for which there are a large number of species that are in that vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered categories. Okay, next slide. one of the headline statistics that got reported in the press was 1 million of perhaps 8 million species are threatened with extinction going forward. We currently know that the global extinction rate is 10 to hundreds times higher than it has been over the past 10 million years or so, which we can base things on the fossil records. Okay, next slide. And so this figure shows kind of what we know over the recent past, the number of extinctions, which, as I said before, the number of extinctions to date has not been that high, although it may accelerate rapidly going forward if we lose a large number of those endangered and threatened species. But you can see, compared to the gray bar at the very bottom, what the background rate of extinction would be, and then what it has been over the past several centuries of extinction rates for various groups from fishes all the way up to amphibians, which are suffering the greatest or the highest rate. Next slide. And it's not just all species, kind of a blanket, but one of the things that is worrying is that in particular of the species that we depend upon, both animal and crop species, there are a large number of local varieties and breeds which have been lost, kind of reducing the ability to respond to pests and pathogens or changes in environmental conditions. So this wouldn't show up as a loss of species, but a reduction in the genetic variability within the species. Next slide. So the nature group, really the way they summarize this is that the fabric of life is not only getting smaller, but increasingly thinner, simpler, and more frayed. So this idea of extinctions are one symptom of this, but the loss of variability within species, the loss of habitats, basically virtually all indicators of the global state of nature are declining. Next slide. The report also had a large sections throughout on the contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And as I said, this was spread throughout the report, so everything from how do Indigenous communities conserve land relative to non-Indigenous landscapes, and what is how does that impact on biodiversity and the nature's contributions to people. Next slide. And as you can see here, there is a large land area associated with Indigenous peoples and local communities. They tend to do a better job. So they have a quarter of global lands, roughly speaking, under their management, but 35% of highly conserved ecosystems and 35% of protected areas are in their jurisdictions. And generally, the agrobiodiversity and nature as a whole are declining less rapidly in areas that are managed by Indigenous and local communities. But even there, they're under pressure, and nature even there is under pressure. Next slide. Okay, so we will come back. Both Alex and I will talk. I'll talk about nature's contributions to people, and Alex will talk about drivers. But I'm going to go on to the later parts of the report, and in particular, in Chapter 3, there was a discussion of how we are doing relative to the biodiversity, Aichi biodiversity targets, and how we're doing relative to the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, next slide. So this is a summary figure from the report that tries to discern how we are doing under the rows here are the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. And then you'll see from poor, moderate to good, or if we don't have enough information to determine, that's the last column of unknown. And you'll see various markers here. So, for example, in the third line under incentives, there were 2 metrics here, and both of those metrics showed poor return. Okay, so down lower under status, protected and conserved areas, there were actually 6 metrics here, 2 of which were good and 4 of which were moderate. So there's an area overall where we're actually doing much better in terms of protected and conserved areas than we are under many of the other things. In particular, the drivers and the pressures are almost all indicators were in the poor column, whereas the protected and conserved areas, we were either moderate or good. But you can see the range of outcomes here. The overall message is not that we're not doing all that well. Report card has a bit more red on it than I'm comfortable with, for sure. Next slide. And a similar analysis was done for how we're doing with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So this group looked at the ones that were primarily, or you could say there was a large intersection with nature. And so, particularly things like clean water, climate, the biodiversity ones, life below water, life on land. And again, there were multiple metrics that were relevant for each of these. And again, looking at whether it was poor or declining, whether we were doing sort of moderate or there was partial support. You'll note here that there is no good category. So in fact, what this group found was that there wasn't anything that we could put in sort of a positive trend or to say that things are going well in that sector. So that was a column that was left out. Next slide. Okay, and then you can hit it again. I think there's some words that go along with this slide. There we go. So looking into the future, again, there was a group that did scenarios, and they looked at 3 different scenarios ranging from rapid economic growth, as you see in the top one, to the bottom one, trying to think about how could we get to global sustainability, global sustainable development. Next slide. So they basically projected ahead what does this scenario imply for greenhouse gas emissions, for land use change, and hence then what does this mean for likely biodiversity metrics. In this case, they measured species richness. What does this mean for projections for material of nature's contributions to people, so food and fiber and energy and so on, and for regulating NCP. So things about air, filtering air and water pollutants, storing carbon, et cetera. And as you can see here, if you go to rapid economic growth, you get higher material contributions, but a reduction in both projected biodiversity and also in the projections for other ecosystem services, right? So other, like the regulating services, those things that nature provides that regulate environmental conditions. On the other hand, thinking about global sustainability, we have increases in both material NCP, but not as high as under economic optimism, but positive regulating NCP. And that's significant. When I get to when I talk more in depth about nature's contributions to people, the regulating NCP over the past 50 years have shown a declining trend. It's significant, I think, that even in designing a global sustainability scenario, that biodiversity still declines. So none of the scenarios going forward did biodiversity remain unchanged or increase. Under all of the scenarios, it declined. Next slide. So the summary of this is that there are there were these scenarios that went down, but then they turned it around and said, are there ways to include transformative change that would meet the 2030 sustainability objectives and the 2050 vision for biodiversity? So the chapter 5 in the IPBES report talks about what a future scenario would look like that would have a world in which nature and people thrive. Next slide. So this was that there had to be changes in production and consumption of energy and food, so how and where we produce food and energy, low to moderate population growth, and obviously dealing with climate adaptation and mitigation. Okay, next slide. So in kind of pulling a lot of these pieces together, one of the summary statements was we have in fact dramatically reconfigured the Earth and the fabric of life on Earth. We're increasingly becoming interconnected, but not equal. Next slide. So chapters 5 and 6 then started to get into what can we do about it. If we don't think these trends that we've seen to date and that some of the future scenarios that were analyzed in chapter 4 are leading us to the kind of future we want, what can we do about this? The next slide. So some of the last part of the report was thinking about transformational change. So in order to meet the societal and environmental goals going forward, to really attain the Sustainable Development Goals and the Aichi targets, there must be transformative change. Next slide. And some of the elements here, obviously dealing with climate change and the other aspects of nature deterioration. So even if you address climate, there are other things that need to be thought about: nutrient cycling, land use, pollution, air and water pollution, and these things are interconnected. And so the difficult part is, not thinking in terms of silos, but thinking in terms of systems, and that this actually runs from very local to global problems. Next slide. So good news is that we oftentimes know what to do. So knowledge and tools are available for this kind of transformative change, but we have not deployed them nearly smartly enough or nearly wide enough to actually achieve the kind of transformative change that will be necessary. Next slide. So as the report says, there are examples of transformative change, but we haven't scaled it up to the degree necessary, right? So there may be small pockets, small communities which are moving towards sustainable lifestyles, but that's certainly not the norm. And the bold actions and commitments from local to global levels will be needed in order to achieve the kind of future that in which nature and people thrive. Next slide. So in a summary, at the very highest level, what this report shows, this was commissioned to be a comprehensive global picture of the status and trends of biodiversity and ecosystem services, so the links between nature and people. There are clearly worrisome trends, and that we're heading towards a future which is not the kind of future I think that most people hope for. The kind of fabric of life is fraying, and in order to remove that strain and prevent further unraveling, it's a call for prompt action, tackling the root causes of nature's deterioration, and coordinating and integrating across sectors and scales. Okay, next slide, and I think, Alex, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Lydia and Sarah and Steve, for laying out the big picture. That's great, because that covers the whole report. Steve and I will then add some tidbits and try to go quickly given the time and that you want to have questions. So as we went through the chapters, chapter 1 set the scene. As Steve said, we're the drivers, or trying to talk about why did all those changes happen over the last half century. I'm going to break that into 2 pieces. This is part 1, sort of socioeconomic factors and trends. And then part 2 would be policy responses to changes that we've seen. So go to the next slide. Thanks. So the term direct drivers is used in the report. That has a very particular meaning. It's a big category of impacts on nature. You can see the list: changes in land use and in sea use, distinct from directly exploiting an organism, change in the climate, pollution of air or water, and invasion of alien species. So those are big trends that affect nature. And if you click down one more, Sarah. In the report, there's an attempt to attribute so the size of the impacts. So the colors over there on the left suggest, that land and sea use had a larger effect than climate change, et cetera. I was not involved. I don't think Steve was in those attributions, but in case they're of interest, those are in the report. And as you move into the meat of what we did in drivers, really these things are big aggregations from a bunch of human behaviors. So go to the next slide. So these are really the proximate causes, these economic or societal sectors. And here we have a bunch of literature review in the report, and Patty Balvanera, who is my co-coordinating lead author for this section, led this effort. So I'll just quickly read. We've got fisheries, agriculture, forestry, direct harvesting, mining or extraction, infrastructure, tourism, relocation, including migration, illegal activities, cutting across the others, and restoration, because sometimes people act to put nature back. So there's literature reviews on each of those if they're of interest. And if we do one more click. So each of those affects each of those direct drivers, right? There's pollution from agriculture and pollution from mining. There is climate change impacts of forestry and of tourism. So that's going backwards to the actions that add up to those big direct drivers. But if we do 2 more clicks, each of those sectors is in turn a bunch of human choices that are affected by a bunch of other drivers. If we go to the next slide, which in the language of IPBES are indirect drivers. So the figure to the left is the figure in some IPBES page. Breaking those out, the indirect drivers that we have literature reviews on are the values. And I should just say that the next IPBES assessment is on values, and the same Patty Balvanera is one of the co-chairs. Because values are behind all of these decisions, but there's also demographic changes, standard population dynamics, migration and urbanization are huge. Human capital dynamics, including the loss or the spreading of indigenous local knowledge. Big technological changes, both in primary sectors like agriculture and biomass energy, and in urbanization and industry, which often involves the concentration of people and capital. Economic drivers, structural transitions in economies, so moving, when a whole economies move from agriculture to manufacturing to services, makes a big difference. And again, the concentrated control of production, such as large firms at one end of a supply chain dealing with small producers in forests at the other end. And finally, huge changes over time in trade. Materials flows, including nature embedded in goods, and financial flows, which are part of facilitating all those behaviors, including things like tax havens, which can lower the ability to regulate those behaviors. So that's the other big section of literature review in our Chapter 2 drivers. There's all these indirect drivers and then all those sectors. So if you were to be looking for the literature review, that's what you would find. But now, instead of breaking it all down, I'm try to sum it up for the sort of framing we tried to add to the introduction of our section. If we go to the next slide. Oops. Uh-oh, can we go to the next slide? Now I'm a little worried. Ah, there we are. Okay, great. Oh, we're back. Here we are. So I'm going to sum it up even further. This stylized picture doesn't apply to anything, but it sets up what we want to talk about in terms of inequality. If we think of in the red lines, environmental quality falling, sorry, I probably skipped a slide, that's okay. Renewable resources falling, non-renewable resources falling, GDP rising. At a certain point, trade has increased a great deal and it affects nature. Governance has increased. And at the top, economic inequality has increased. And why do we say that if we go to the next slide? This is from the World Bank. Over a long period of time, global inequality rising, in particular between countries. Of course, within countries, inequality has risen and fallen, but on average, they find it flat. So we're focusing here on trade between countries and inequality. If we go to the next slide. So what happens, not only in terms of economic benefits, but what happens in terms of nature? How are the changes in terms of nature distributed across countries? The next slide. So different things can happen. We certainly have seen stabilization and recovery of some declining resources. We've seen stabilization alone, and we've certainly seen ongoing degradation. So where are those different things happening? First, we'll make a very general statement on the next slide. It looks like in the richer countries, not only is GDP rising more quickly, and so is self-governance, like Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act in the US. And so are imports. And imports of nature. We import things made from wood that are cut elsewhere. And that makes a big difference because importing nature can help you rise in consumption without knocking over as much as your own nature. So of course it's not true in all rich countries, but on average, more environmental quality rises and more renewable resource rises happen. Of course, renewable resources keep falling, but maybe at a lower rate. And this stylized picture applies nowhere, but in general, it may be reasonably compared to the next slide. Yeah. Where the lower incomes, GDP is rising less. The governing of nature is sometimes local, but sometimes it's global with global financing. Nature tends to be exported. Environmental quality might be stabilizing, and a lot of renewable resources are still falling, as are stocks of non-renewable. So mostly we want to set up the question, as we look across this long period of time, what has happened to economic outcomes from all this behavior, but also what's the distribution across countries, and of course, if we had more time within countries, of these changes in environment and resources. And so these are stylized pictures to set the ideas. The next couple slides have a little data. If we go to the next slide. This is from the World Bank's Hidden Dimensions work from a presentation in which, in this very summarized fashion, they find that over 2 decades, the lower income countries are falling in the terms of the value of their natural capital. Lower middle income rising a little, and upper middle income rising more. So some countries appear to be doing better economically or have done better, and also the natural capital stocks are improving, and others have done worse, and their natural capital stocks are falling. All of these computations have a tremendous number of choices. The bank folks will be the very first to tell you in amazing detail, but this is very summarized. And maybe one more slide. And you can get down to the country level, and there's huge negative numbers to the left, and those are scary in a few ways. There's lots of discussions like when is savings the same as a wealth change, etc. But the basic gradients here, that lower income countries could have fallen a lot in their variously measured capital stocks, follows the same theme in that same Hidden Dimensions publication of the bank. And so last slide for this section. So it's not surprising that poorer and richer countries play different roles in trade. We expect countries who are doing better in consumption to invest more in environment, and vice versa. If you're not eating that well, you might make different trade-offs. But the trade-offs that are being made are critical. So when we can import nature in the blue line, what we have here is degradation to the right and income going up. And the typical trend is we move up and to the right. We get more income and then we degrade. How do the rich countries manage to move backwards where they get more income and don't degrade? Part of it is policy, and part of it is importing nature. But that means the countries that are exporting nature, which started with lower income and are growing less quickly in terms of income, they continue to degrade as they export nature. And the prices really matter. Those are prices in supply chains. Those are also implicit prices when the World Bank funds protected areas to export global public goods. The Bolsonaro administration in Brazil is basically saying that right now. And global governing, where we potentially cut off local production, could improve the environment in the purple line, but it might be at a high cost of local output. Again, this is stylized. It's to raise thoughts about the trade-offs we might see, and we're now trying to take this to better data with the World Bank, who have made great investments, but we couldn't include that in IPBES. So that's to stop here. So there's a whole bunch of behaviors with a whole bunch of indirect drivers, and they vary a great deal across the globe. They're interconnected by trade and policy, and that's a place to hand off to Steve's computations of impacts on human welfare.
Great, thank you, Alex. I'm going to talk very briefly about the section on nature's contributions to people, or ecosystem services. There's a huge range of these ecosystem services, which we'll get to. Go to the next slide. And then, yeah, and as we talked about earlier under nature, there's been a transformation, and many of those transformations have led to declines in many of the ecosystem services, or nature's contributions to people. Next slide. This one's always slow. I think it's got too many pictures on it. But anyway, this is just the range of NCP, or nature's contributions to people, ranging all the way from habitat to biodiversity through regulating services, so air and water purification, regulation of hazards, soils, water quality, air quality. And then to material provisioning services, so food and energy, medicines, material goods, through to what used to be called cultural, and under NCP is, or under IPBES, has been referred to as non-material services. And the reason for talking about non-material as opposed to cultural services, so things like tourism and recreation, education, science, learning, identity, is that there is a portion of culture in all services. So think about food. The value of food certainly is in its calories, but it's also oftentimes in the shared meals and in the cultural traditions. So anyway, that's the reason for talking about basically material services, non-material services, and regulating services. Next slide. So what we tried to do was to summarize the global status and trends of, we characterized 18 different categories of these regulating material and non-material services. The largest kind of thing that jumps out at you is, in terms of the material services, we're generally doing better. There is more timber produced, more food being produced than ever before. But the production of this is actually one of the reasons, it is one of the drivers that's leading to changes in ecosystems that are also leading to declines in many other ecosystem services. Next slide. So here's where we try to summarize what we know about the trends over the past 50 years. In some cases, the trend is for shorter time periods if we didn't have good data going back basically to 1970. So it's for the best data and the longest time period that we had for these 18 different categories of NCP. If there's a down arrow, we have a decline, a severe decline. The kind of arrow going 45 degrees down is for a slight decline, and then going off to the right, if it's upward, it's an increase. And again, the pattern here is, if it's a material good, food and feed, energy, those are oftentimes increasing, whereas outside of that, almost everything has showed a decline over the past 50 years. For many of these, we had multiple indicators. So for example, if you look at food and feed, we had the extent of agricultural land, which has gone up. And we also had the abundance of marine fish stocks, which have declined. So even within a category, there are differences depending on which part of it you're looking at. The other thing I'll mention here is that kind of shaded out, but either the circles or the down and up arrows indicate whether the global trend is consistent across all areas or whether it in fact shows regional differences. So Alex talked about some of the differences between developed and developing countries, and certainly we see that in terms of, for example, the extent of forests. Okay, next slide. The other thing that became clear to us, we think this is something important for the community thinking about ecosystem services going forward. There has been a lot of confusion in this arena of NCP or ecosystem services, even up to the name of, do we call this nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services? Oftentimes people are talking past each other. So there's the potential of nature to create a service or provide a service. There's the actual realized service, which may or may not be the same thing as the output that people tend to care about, and then ultimately the impact on human well-being or good quality of life. So if you think about water quality regulation, so the ecosystem may provide a service of filtering the water. If there's no anthropogenic pollution or other pollution in the water to begin with, then just the fact that the ecosystem could filter water doesn't mean that it actually filters water. So you might have a system which is actually becoming more polluted, for which the realized service, the amount of pollution that's removed is going up, even while the water quality, the output that people care about, is going down. So we think it's important to be clear about where in this chain you're actually talking about. So the previous slide, I was actually talking about the potential of nature to contribute to good quality of life, so the potential NCP. Next slide. And then finally, and this is a good transition back to you, Alex, which is that why is it important to talk about these ecosystem services? Well, many of the ecosystem services, the material ecosystem services, people have a direct incentive to provide them. I mean, that's why we transform landscapes to grow crops, for example. You get the value of those crops. But many of these other ecosystem services, they're either invisible or people don't have the incentives to maintain ecosystems to continue the provision of those ecosystem services. So Alex, it's back over to you, and I think you're going to pick up on some of these points.
All right, thank you, Steve. Okay, I'll go quickly, maybe to the next slide. So not only do we have these trends, and that's a figure from the report in which GDP is growing, consumption is growing, but we wanted to show that the different color lines are the richer and poorer countries. Trade is a huge impact here, such that the extraction of biomass in the C panel has a different ranking across the country groups than did the production and consumption in A and B. And the other thing we wanted to emphasize here was the difference between D and E. D is protected areas, and they have grown, but impressively, they're actually pretty high for poor countries on the red line to start. And those look like protected areas financed for global impacts and exports of global public goods, as mentioned before. And so those stay as high as middle-income countries even now, even though richer countries started to do more and more protection. Whereas the air pollution in E, it's flipped in terms of the ranking. The local public goods seem to be much worse in those poor countries. And F is sort of a placeholder to point out that even in richer countries, say dealing with fertilizer use in agriculture, non-point source regulation has a long way to go before it's widely successful. You're still getting eutrophication, say, across the United States. So what do we have here? The top level is these trends we talked about before. There's policy responses, and actually, if we do one click downwards, those policy responses include ones with global implications and one with local implications, and we wanted to distinguish those. I think we can double click downward to the next slide. Yeah, so, and now, again, with that big picture trade interaction story, we'll break it back down. We looked at different responses. We do want to emphasize environmental norms, which we would say do shift over time. in both directions from policies. Policies may discourage people from getting involved or encourage people to come along to a new equilibrium. Market interactions, such as within supply chains, there's a lot of potential from supply chains. It's not clear there's been a lot of impact. I'm happy to talk all this. I'm going fast. I'm happy to follow up with anyone at any time. It may well be that private supply chains are going to most achieve things working in coordination with the states. Local community coordination, we think of, say, the Eleanor Ostrom literature. As Steve said, there are quite a few successes in particular locations, but not everywhere. And there's interesting questions about the lessons for global coordination from local coordination successes. Government policy is certainly a major focus. I would want to emphasize, and we emphasize, it's not only increasing conservation policy and increasing the impacts, it's even adjusting development policies. Development policies have huge impacts, and if we merely let development go and conserve around it, I don't think we'll get the scale of change that's being brought up by this report. And just emphasizing there's equity considerations in a lot of those policies, and perhaps sometimes undermining their success is a lack of consideration of equity considerations. And then, of course, we need global coordination. There's been some efforts. It's not totally obvious they're increasing, but I'll move to the next slide. So we have literature reviews on all that, and maybe one click down. This is not correct there. There we go, my fault. Yep, thank you. Adjustments to development policies, I just want to say what I mean by that. Private property rights make a huge difference in terms of how people make their choices. Could be pro-nature, could be anti. Even concessions can actually allow a lot of eco-service provision. And we've seen cases where concessions do better than protected areas because, as Steve mentioned, of private incentives, such as to defend your own rights against invasion, which public actors cannot always do. Fuel subsidies have been an enormous amount of money that have subsidized degradation. They could be shifted. Why are they not shifted? Equity. That could be addressed through transferring of cash, analogous to what people are saying in the Democratic debates about a carbon tax that transfers back to households. And finally, transportation infrastructure. Think of China's BRI. There's going to be huge transport infrastructure investments around the world. Changes in routes and methods could greatly lower damage. And not all those routes are actually economic winners, but it would require coordinated planning across development and environment, which we say is rare, and that certainly builds on other people's statements. And the next slide, please. And to the conservation, on the protected area side, indeed they're rising, tremendously variable in impact. Indigenous lands, as Steve said, have played an important role. Incentives have also been rising greatly. Again, not always clear that they have impact. When they're prioritized and when you can condition payments on benefits, they appear to work. When they're purely voluntary, as seems to be less the case in China, which seems to have an effective plan, sometimes you might block a high percentage but a very low pressure and have low impact. There's various shifts, like you could stack services and let people sell more than one. And then people try to think of getting these things on the cheap. And I would just say that's very sensible on the cost side. It may not work as well in terms of the equity of surplus sharing and thinking of red projects that get rejected because of the lack of local gains. And so then just as a punchline, we're thinking about types of protection, thinking about including multiple use with poor stakeholders versus strict. We're thinking about collective payments versus individual that could lower the cost of monitoring and use local social capital, and generally focusing on adjusting these policies to local contexts. I've said this all very quickly. These are things we try to comment on the report, and of course, you all will have expert views on many of them. And one last slide. Because we're in this system where we go around and around and people act and nature's contributions go up or down and policies respond, well, then people then respond to policies. So in the report, we want to emphasize the dynamics that can happen, and those can spiral up or spiral down. If we click down. So for instance, private responses to policies can lead to spillovers or leakage that make impact zero. And then there's environmental conflicts in which there's local choices that lead to scarcity, and then there's aggregate climate change, and that can destroy local cooperation. So the dynamics can really go bad, and that picture is from the report and purports to be a map of environmental conflicts. And of course, there's many choices in such a map. On the other hand, to the right, even if fishing dynamics are going the wrong way between the dynamics of fish stocks and private profit-seeking choices, the paper that we're taking those pictures from suggests that a simple intervention and a rule shift shifted the dynamics of private incentives, changed the fish stock dynamics, and led to different equilibria. So just want to emphasize the back and forth nature of the social and ecological system as we hand it on to different parts of the report. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Steve and Alex. So we have a few minutes left for questions. So if anyone has a question, please type it into the chat box and I'll read it off and we can have our presenters respond to it. Just to start us off, I think sort of generally, could one of you speak to sort of your understanding of where this report has gained traction globally or within a particular country with policy or decision makers?
Steve, you presented it, right?
Okay, yeah, I can talk. I was going to say, I can't talk, I'm muted, but thank you for unmuting me. Releasing this in Paris, that's where the report was finalized and where the press conference was. There was a lot more press interest and pickup of this in Europe than in the US, for example. In terms of like what particularly seemed to catch people's attention, the 1 million species in peril out of 8 million, that really caught on. I mean, I saw far more references to that than I saw to anything else. I'm not sure I can answer, and I think it may be too soon to answer, has this been picked up by policymakers? I think there are a number of key meetings, international meetings next year where we'll get a better sense of whether this is catching on and making an impact or not. So there's the IUCN meeting next year. There's also the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting in China, and China seems to be wanting to play a bigger role in this arena. So there's potential there that it will make more of an impact. I mean, I guess I have to say that the sort of short answer is kind of outside of the U.S., in particular places I'm familiar with, Europe and China, seem to have paid more attention to this necessarily than in the U.S. But I don't know, Alex, you probably have other responses.
Yeah, not so much. I appreciate that, Steve. I guess I would go on a different dimension just to complement everything you say. I do see in other countries where I work attention to these larger scale commitments, various COPs, thinking of the Minamata COP for mercury. And so these broad statements, I think, do provide something for governments to answer. The concern that I have is sometimes the communication comes across as we really need to do something. And I feel like we've reached the point where we've known that since Silent Spring and before. And the whole do anything language, as opposed to, we've tried a lot of things, as you said, Steve, we could do it smarter and more widely. Sometimes we lose the do it smarter part when these things trickle out. And otherwise, I would echo what you said.
Thanks. So I have kind of a two-part question that just came in. What are the next steps for IPBES on moving this forward and moving on from here? And more specifically, are there plans for the report during the SDG Summit this fall?
So I know that the Secretariat and some of the co-chairs and the kind of the IPBES Secretariat are going to each of these and continue to want to get the report out as widely as possible and into these various venues. I'm not up on the details of in particular, what they're going to be doing at the next meeting that was mentioned, but I know there is continuing interest. Over the longer period, I mean, my hope is that this establishes that IPBES follows IPCC in that they do periodic international reports that keep showing like what are we doing and what's changing, and has there been in particular an uptick in policy and in responses. I think that's the goal right now, but we'll see. I mean, you know, unlike I think this is less well funded than the IPCC. At times it felt like it was kind of going along on a shoestring, and so we'll see whether governments continue to support this activity going forward. And I hope that they do, because I think it's important for the international community to continue to have fingers on the pulse of what's happening to ecosystems and biodiversity. But anyway, I think there is continuing interest in keeping the report in front of groups and in representing it at these international meetings going forward.
Thank you. I have another question here where someone's asked, is there a video or education material of IPBES for a broad audience that might be available?
Just to play tag with Steve, I'm pretty sure they were producing a number of such videos at the time that it was closing. I thought they were on IPBES websites. I haven't personally looked at them since we were doing the report. Maybe Steve knows more though.
I don't. I mean, it's a really good question, and there really should be. I would think the thing to do, I don't know offhand myself either, and I probably should, but you could look at the IPBES website and see what's there. And if there isn't something there that you can use, I would suggest it to them. And if you look at a response, why don't you write to Lydia or to myself, and we'll suggest it to IPBES that is something that really should be done. There was a lot of emphasis in IPBES on communication, so not just having the report sit on in file cabinet somewhere, but to actually try to communicate the results, the important results, in a more easily understandable way. So what you're asking seems to me to be something that IPBES should be doing. They may well be doing it right now, but if they're not, we should get on it.
Yeah, it looks, somebody just shared a link to, it looks like a IPBES YouTube channel with some short summary clips within the chat. So if anyone's interested, there's a link there that you can take a look at. So I don't see any more questions, so I'll take one more opportunity to thank Alex and Steve for taking time out of their day to help summarize this report. We really appreciate it, and thanks everyone for joining today.